Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Kris, and joining me today is Emerging Civil War co-founder and chief historian and awesome, great, good guy, Kris White. Kris, how are you today?
Oh, that's the best introduction I've had in a while. Usually it's me and you making fun of one another, or Gary and I making fun of one another. So thank you.
I'm sure there'll be plenty of chop busting as we get going. Inevitably is. Uh, but we've been talking about ethics and issues on the blog in September, and one of the things I wanted to kind of explore a little more in detail and in maybe a more conversational sort of way is just the idea of Gettysburg as the elephant in the room and some of the ethical questions it poses to us as historians as we try to navigate around this giant elephant because it does seem to have its own gravitational pull in Civil War studies. Kris, you fell in love with the Civil War at Gettysburg. You have passed the Gettysburg Guide test. You spent a lot of time there producing content for the American Battlefield Trust. You're super familiar. You've written about it. What does Gettysburg mean to you in the context of Civil War studies?
Well, when I was younger, it was everything. It was the only thing. And I do have the feeling for a lot of folks, that's the way. I mean, Gettysburg is a cottage industry. It's not just with this current generation of vloggers, bloggers, historians, enthusiasts. I mean, it started in the weeks following the battle. The genesis of all of this goes back to a few people in the wake of the battle itself, and I'm sure we'll get into that. But for me, it was everything, and now it's that easy uh, northern star to point towards for somebody who's either new or new-ish to the community, and even for buffs because it happens roughly right in the middle of the war. Almost everybody knows about it. Either they know about the battle itself, they know about the Gettysburg Address with Lincoln, or they know both. So you can use it as this happened before Gettysburg, this happened after Gettysburg. It's like historians used to use the birth and death of Jesus as a way marker, BC, before Christ, after Christ, or after death. Um, I think that's what Gettysburg is. And plus, you don't have Ulysses Grant there. You don't have some of the larger names like Stonewall Jackson, but you do have Robert E. Lee, George Gordon Meade, Hancock, others. So there's a lot of folks who are there that people get to know because of Gettysburg, or in a lead up or the lead out from there.
And General Pickett, George Pickett is one of those guys that people probably know because of Gettysburg and assumes a large position in Civil War history because of that, who might not otherwise get that sort of recognition either.
Yeah, I mean, he once had a buffet that the American Battlefield Trust is helping to preserve right now, or not the building, but taking down the building to bring the battlefield back to life. And I think that's what you see. Every battle, big or small, will have its larger than life personalities created, good or bad. It's not always a positive why you have a reputation because of a battle, but like you get the Chamberlain. People wouldn't have known Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain had it not been for a bayonet charge. May or may not have been led by him. But of course, you have the Killer Angels that caught Michael Shara's attention. So it also caught Ken Burns' attention. So that gives us him. George Pickett, of course, with Pickett's Charge, if you want to call it that, or Longstreet's Assault, a few different names for it. So you see that with most Civil War, at least large scale battles, where people's reputations, sometimes warranted or unwarranted, are earned on those fields.
And for me, that sometimes makes a useful way marker. When I talk about the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse and I take people out onto where the action opened up on the first day of the battle on May 8th, 1864. And we're going to talk about Gouverneur K. Warren. And they might look at me with a blank face. And then I say, you might know him because he's got a statue on Little Round Top at Gettysburg. Oh, yeah, that guy. And so there's a point of reference that they can suddenly contextualize something.
Yeah, and I think that's above all, whenever it comes to just is a mile marker or that northern star. I think that's the benefit of Gettysburg. I think that really gives us that lead into it. Folks who aren't that familiar with other things, they probably have heard of Gettysburg, and frankly, if they've experienced a major battlefield uh, uh, of the American Civil War, it's probably going to be Gettysburg. Back in the day, I would talk to a lot of people who went to Shiloh, which always surprised me because I mean, Shiloh is a beautiful battlefield, but I mean, it is still in the middle of nowhere. You'll hear people talk about Vicksburg. You'll hear them especially talk about Antietam, but it's almost always they come to Gettysburg. Or if they haven't been there and they've been to those other places, that's their Mecca. They're going to go to Gettysburg. They want to see it. They want to experience it. And I think, you know, for both good and bad, it's a great example of getting people interested. I've always said about the Civil War and history in general, it's much like selling a house. Once you get someone through the door, you're halfway to the sale. So once you get them to step foot onto a battlefield, in most cases, you can convince them to become interested in either the personalities, the action, the post-war memory. Something will resonate with them, and they'll walk away with it. They might not become experts in it, but they'll at least have a better appreciation or deeper appreciation.
Yeah. And I'm sure there are a lot of people listening and watching who are like, "Oh yeah, that's how I got interested. I went to Gettysburg." To me, one of the things I wrestle with though as a historian is people go through the door and they see Gettysburg and woo wow and the lights get turned on, but they don't necessarily go deeper into the house. So that they don't necessarily explore more of the story of the Civil War or the Western theater, the civilian stuff, or like Gettysburg becomes it for them. Um, and that's something I wrestle with a little bit because the story of the war is so much more interesting and dynamic and complex than that. Why do you think so many people just kind of get in there and that's as far as they go?
Well, it's almost like quicksand for them. And for somebody who's listening to this podcast, they're not going to be the typical person who shows up at Gettysburg who's never been there before, who will hire a licensed battlefield guide and they'll go around the field. And I don't think that most deep, deeply ingrained Civil War buffs who've never engaged with a licensed battlefield guide one on one would understand that you have 2.5 hours as an LBG, licensed battlefield guide, to go around the battlefield and tell this story. I mean, that's a lot of story to tell. It's 26 miles worth of driving. You have literally tens of thousands of stories with these soldiers who are on the field. So it's for somebody who's listening to this, they're probably like, yeah, Gettysburg's really important, but I didn't realize that, for some people it's not that important or it's not that interesting. But for the lay person who shows up there the first time, I mean, my God, it is, as you said before we led into this, it's a lot of edutainment. you know, Back in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, you get on Steinway Avenue and you'd have all these stores that, a lot of them are tchotchke stores, but man, they would have Civil War soldiers, hats, flags, guns. I was that kid running around
Mhm.
Little Round Top with a picture of Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain on my T-shirt, and I had the hat, had the gun, all that fun stuff. Then you go into a bookstore, when they existed in town, and you would go around and see just a mammoth a collection of books about the battle. I mean, everything from the overview, the little blue books that the National Park Service and Eastern National would put out, to Ed Coddington's Bible on the battle. So, I mean, when you go down there, you have the tours, the tour center, you have the driving tour, 1,400 plus monuments, markers, and tablets on the battlefield. You have the old wax museum, now the Heritage Center. You have the American Battlefield Trust animated map that's being shown there. The cyclorama. I mean, I could keep going on and on and on. And almost no other battlefield in the U.S. has anything like this. I can only think of a handful of battlefields around the world that are that much of a niche cottage industry that keeps things going, like Aeromarche at D-Day, or if you go to Agincourt, they have their interesting stores and different things there. So I could think of some places you can go to, but Gettysburg really is a cottage industry of education, entertainment, and where it kind of comes together. So if you're a new person, you're going to think, because you're there, that is the epicenter of the war, and that's the only story that's going to be told. Plus, the veterans also do the same thing, where they will start to focus on that story so much. And before I kick it over to you, Kris, I think it's telling when we look back at the primary sources of this war, and how many soldiers weren't even at the Battle of Gettysburg, but refer to it. We see this at Fredericksburg, where we have soldiers who never fought behind the famed stone wall, who are 5 miles away, but are talking about being behind the stone wall there because they want to be on the important part of the field as they view it, or the battle, the famous part of the battlefield. My wife's ancestor, who served in the 8th North Carolina Infantry, served nowhere near Gettysburg, but for the rest of his life, and he was the head of his Confederate veteran organization in North Carolina, claimed that he not only fought at Gettysburg, but was wounded there. And it showed up in all these newspapers and all these accounts of him. And no one ever did the homework to look at the order of battle for 2 seconds and say, hey, the 8th North Carolina never fought there. He was down in South Carolina at that time. So, it's not just buffs. Excuse me, it's not just historians, it's also the veterans who wanted to place themselves at this, what many people see as the epicenter of the Civil War.
In much the same way that Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain claimed to be at Woodstock. I mean, there were so many people who weren't at Woodstock who said they were there, and you'd think,
Well, John
of
Brown
course.
Gordon could take Moscow. Just ask him with his division or brigade out in the wilderness.
Uh, yeah, talking about the veterans, I mean, Gettysburg's geography makes it pretty convenient to be the source of a lot of myth building because it's so close to the population centers and the media centers. And after the war, people could get there easily to revisit the place. Talk to me a little bit about, like, how that then makes Gettysburg into Gettysburg because of its geographical convenience.
Yeah, we have to go back to the battle itself. So Robert E. Lee marches into Pennsylvania. They have the battle. Union's victorious. United States forces pursue him back into Maryland and into West Virginia and then Virginia. And then you have the next great invasion of Gettysburg, and that's the do-gooders who show up. You have the Sanitary Commission, the Christian Commission, people who want to come in morbidly curious to learn more about the battlefield, people who are coming to find their relatives who have either been wounded or killed there. You have Alexander Gardner's photographic team, Matthew Brady's photographic teams, and they're snapping photographs all around. So it grows up quickly. And the fact that we're only about 53 miles from Baltimore, Maryland, and then another 20 odd miles removed from there with Washington D.C., Philadelphia today by cars 2 to 2.5 hours away, Pittsburgh 3.5 to 4 hours away. Gettysburg has 10 roads leading in and out of it. The railroad has just arrived prior to the war there, so it's easy, as you say, to get there. Plus, most of the major newspapers are in the Eastern Theater at the time, so they're reporting heavily on what's happening on the East. But you had the Army come here, then you had these do-gooders arrive. So Alexander Gardner's team and Brady's team, that's going to help to push the images of war, like it happened after Antietam. The pictures of the dead, the pictures of the landscape, that's going to capture the imagination of the people. Then you're also going to have the locals. There's two rivals, two Davids, David McConaughey and David Wills, who come up with the idea of not only there should be a national cemetery placed in Gettysburg for the United States soldiers killed there, but they also should start to preserve the battlefield land, which is the genesis of the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association. And they start trying to preserve land in 1863 and 1864. And some of the first pieces of property they'll buy are at East Cemetery Hill, over at McKnight's Hill, today Stevens Knoll, and some other places on the field. So even in the weeks after the battle, we have, and I don't want to sound ghoulish when I say this, we have Brady's and Gardner's team coming there to take pictures, which are going to not only drive people to Gettysburg, but that's also going to make money for these folks. And quite frankly, the Tyson's brothers, who have a studio there, a photographic studio, they get out onto the field, they start taking pictures of the field, then veterans, then monuments. And I mean, they make that into an industry for tourism. And with it being so close to Baltimore, Harrisburg, which is a huge rail center, Philadelphia, and others, that'll just make it easier and easier for especially the northern populace to arrive in Gettysburg. Fast forward, you have Abraham Lincoln arrive, you have Edward Everett in November of 1863 with the Gettysburg Address and Everett's speech. That again puts the eyes of America onto this little south central Pennsylvania town and drives more people to come there. The estimates vary wildly of how many people saw the actual Gettysburg Address, from 10,000 to 25,000 people. And we joke every person in the crowd heard them, even without a sound system. So, you'll have kind of a two-pronged approach, especially in 1863 to 1870. You'll have the location to the railroad and to the centers of population. Then you will have these people who are starting to turn it into a cottage industry with Brady, Gardner, McConaughey, Wills making the National Cemetery, and then you add into it the official historian of the battle, John Bachelder, who basically cons Congress into giving him $50,000 to write the history of the Battle of Gettysburg. The guy's not a historian. He's also not a colonel, by the way, even though he calls himself Colonel Bachelder. He's an artist by trade. And he has a lot of influence on what was said about the battle, where monuments were placed, and the interpretation, and that carries on to this day. I know that was a
I will.
long-winded question about it, but this is a huge, huge topic.
Well, I just want to point out that you and I are also both colonels. So,
We are technically, because we are a Kentucky colonels, and I have my commission right over there, Colonel McCoskey.
well, yes, I'll say yes. So, um, and kind of tying back to this idea of ethics, we have all these people that suddenly start making money off of this tragedy, which is, nothing that we ourselves necessarily were involved with. But how do you, as you look back at that, um, it seems like a natural thing, of course. People are coming here, so there are going to be people taking advantage of the tourists. The tourists are coming here because of this tragedy. But that's a pretty complicated dynamic from an ethical point of view, I think.
Yeah, and so we have the Springs Hotel that pops up on land today, owned by the American Battlefield Trust along Willoughby Run. And it's a four-story, I believe, four-story hotel with a three-story cupola on top of it. And they dam up Willoughby Run, and they turn that into a swimming pool. And then they have these pristine waters that you can come to their springs. It's a Cadillac. I can never pronounce it. But it's a catalyzing springs, and you can get water out of it. And then the who's of everybody comes through there, like Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, George Gordon Meade, and others to stay at this hotel. In fact, one of our friends owns the old ledger, the sign-in ledger, and it has all these amazing autographs in it. It's one of my favorite artifacts that he owns. So you have a hotel that pops up. Then you have John Bachelder, who is the historian of the battle, and he complains even in 1863, 64, when he's starting to write the history. He's meeting with a brigade that fought in the wheat field, and not one of the five regimental commanders could agree where they were in the wheat field, or even where they were in line of battle. So this is a guy who takes liberties at times with coming up with the history. And then you keep rolling with it. You have these people who want to come back there to grapple with the loss of loved ones. That's what drives a lot of people to Gettysburg in the early days. Some of it's the sightseers. They want to see, like, this big battle happen. What does a battlefield look like? I've read all about it in the war, in the Harper's Weekly and the Philadelphia Inquirer and whatever else. I want to see what it looks like. But you have all these people who come and arrive and want to see or find um, their relative, son, brother, uncle, whomever who's related to them. Now, over the next few decades, Batchelder is going to write a book, a tourist guide, what to see and how to see it at Gettysburg. You can access it on archive.org. It's a fascinating read
Mm.
because not only do you get to see what's in Gettysburg in the 1870s, when this is written about a decade after the battle, but you're also seeing what he suggests you to look at, like Culp's Hill. Hey, go over to Culp's Hill. He didn't say Little Round Top. He said go to Culp's Hill to see the natural earthworks and how Mother Nature's starting to take them back because the trees are healing and all this is happening. You have all these earthworks that these soldiers have created, but Mother Nature's taking it back. He does suggest going to Little Round Top. He suggests going to other places, but you can see over time how that'll change in interpretation. Now, keeping moving into the 1880s, 90s, and early 1900s, we'll have an electric railway that comes onto the Gettysburg battlefield. In fact, parts of the battlefield's walking paths and roads follow the original pathway of this Gettysburg Electric Railway Company. We had Blind Davy, who has one of my favorite pictures of Gettysburg, who had a little studio set up down at Devil's Den in that area, and there was another studio set up on the southern end of Little Round Top. And if you know where you could look, you could actually see some of the old septic system there. And he's sitting there, he's literally blind, and he's got a pistol in his hand. So Blind Davy's sitting there protecting his little place where you could come buy photographs, you could buy candies, you can do other things. There was Tipton Park and Weibel Park or Weeble Park on the south end of the field that had dance studios. There was a casino there at one time. There was a picnic area, a dance pavilion. Prostitution was running amok at one point down amongst the rocks of Devil's Den. So it wasn't, all the purists who were coming to Gettysburg, like a lot of the Civil War buffs who would be listening to this. These are people who are entrepreneurs who are trying to utilize what's in their backyard and utilize the battlefield as a way and a place to make money. So the changing landscape of the battlefield is something that is just as fascinating to me as the battle itself. You had the 3-day battle, July 1st through 3rd. You had the Gettysburg Address and Edward Everett's address, November 19th, 1863. But then you had people just coming back in droves that are going to have an impact not only physically on the battlefield by scraping out trolley lines and other things, but then changing how the battlefield is engaged with and changing the interpretation of it. So I think that that's another long-winded answer for you, but man, it's so complex, and we could sit here for 3 hours just talking about that part of the
Yeah.
battle.
And I think that, that continues on through, and when the Lincoln Highway comes through, which was basically designed to get people to use their automobiles and see the country. And so, that helps bring tourism to Gettysburg in the 20th century. You see the advent of uh, the tourist industry to cater to those motorists, and you get the wax museums and the putt-putt golfs and the land of little horses. And, on the way into town, you got Mr. Ed's Elephant Museum and candy store, so like, and again, this seems like it has nothing to do with the battle, but it's all built around this great tragedy and people wanting to come and see it and then have something to do when they're finished.
Yeah, I mean, Adams County, which is where Gettysburg sits, it's actually the county seat. I mean, it's largely farmland. And because of, the National Park Service, the American Battlefield Trust, and the Gettysburg Foundation and others, the town can really only grow in one direction, and that's east, out along Route 30 east towards York, because the rest of the town's kind of hemmed in by the park. So, you can't really expand your footprint. But that's the modern Gettysburg. But like you said, in the 40s, 50s, 60s, you'd start to see these motor lodges. You had the Lee Mead Inn that used to sit on the south end of the battlefield. In fact, it was rented out by Temple University during the battle. It's right in the pathway of Joseph Kershaw's brigade on what would be the Rose Farm right on the Emmitsburg Road. And Temple University rents it out during World War II to train aerial cartographers. And some of the aerial cartographers who worked there helped to map Hiroshima, where we dropped the atomic bomb 80 years ago this year. So there's ties there. On the Gettysburg battlefield on the north side of it, there was an airfield up there for a long time that did acrobatics and fake bomb runs, and actually during World War II trained pilots. So the town and the battlefield has evolved. During 1917, 1918, you had the Camp of the United States Soldiers at Gettysburg, and then Camp Colt, which was a huge industry to bring in training corps for the infantry in 1917, and then the tank training corps in 1918. The town itself would be utilized, or would utilize the battlefield, I should say, the townspeople, to draw the people in to South Central Pennsylvania and then get money out of their pockets. I'm not throwing any sort of shade at them because they're utilizing the resources near them. And you can't blame them. I mean, it's South Central Pennsylvania. Why else would you drive through there in some of these cities? That drew people in. But it's important to remember that even after the battle, New York troops especially were complaining about the Pennsylvanians, raising the prices on them. They're like, the wounded soldiers paying $1 for bread or $1 for a pitcher of milk. These soldiers wrote home that there were opportunists in the hours after the battle taking advantage of the defenders of Pennsylvania and of the United States, and trying to get into their pockets. And that carries on to this day. I don't want people to think that every person in Gettysburg was there to make money off the battle. That was not the case. Many of these citizens gave up their homes, they gave up their livelihoods to help care for the wounded soldiers. But there is a large volume of letters and diaries that complain about the people from Harrisburg down to Gettysburg trying to take advantage of them, even in the hours after the battle. So the Gettysburg industry started in the wake of this battle. So I want folks to be aware of that. And I'm not, again, I am not judging folks. I wasn't there uh, at the battle. And I also don't live there. So, I don't think it's a bad thing to utilize a resource that's there, as long as you're not damaging the resource, as long as you're not trying to change the history, and as long as you're not trying to take advantage of folks.
Uh, So let me extend that to modern listeners and viewers who, because you used the phrase earlier, the purists of today. But are people purists today, or are they part of this long line of tradition of part of this long tradition of tourists coming to the battlefield to see this spot of tragedy? Are we really any different today than folks were once upon a time?
I don't think we're I don't think we're different. I think we like to think we're righteous, like those people were when they came and thought the same thing. I do think people's hearts are in the right places where they want to protect this resource. They want it to be there for future generations. Now the problem is, whenever it comes to battlefield preservation and education, you know, what's the right story to tell, and what's the right thing to do for the longevity of the resource and things. You and I have always talked about people walking through the doors of historic sites having their own notion of what happened there and wanting to hear quote unquote the right story. And, you know, we were just giving a tour this past weekend at Gettysburg, Gary Edelman and myself. And one of the things Gary had said, for the first 2 decades of him being a guide, he had its walk back how great Robert E. Lee was. People would show up here with this notion that Lee walked on water, did all these things. He was the marble model, all that. And he said, nowadays, because of the changing interpretation, I have to remind people he wasn't that bad of a guy. He was a good general, So he said you could see how the pendulums has swung, and we would see that throughout the entire lifespan of this battlefield. We'll see that with the veterans. We'll see that with historians. We'll see that with movies, and over time, 50 years from now, people might not be as focused on Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. There might be a second Killer Angels of some sort that brings another officer to the fore that they want to talk about. Maybe David Ireland over in Pulp Hill, or something else. So the story is going to change, even though it stays the same. It's just what parts of those stories are we going to be focused on. Now, for the purist, I think that some of the folks want to come to Gettysburg and see it exactly the way it looked like in 1863, and they also want it to be, just battlefield, and that's it. Now, that's where I counter the argument to the people who have to live in the town, have to make money, and have to have a livelihood. And as we pointed out, a lot of their livelihoods are tied to the battlefield. There are motels and hotels down there. We have the tourism industry. You have the Civil War artists. I mean, anything you could think of down through there. It's supporting 17 to 18 million dollars a year in tax revenue coming into the town. So it's well worth the town's time to invest in the battlefield and vice versa. So I think you have to find a balance. And not every we've never been able to, I think, totally find the balance between what's good history and what's good for the resource and what's good for the town and what's good for the economy.
Yeah. Let's go back to John Bachelder, because he's so instrumental in shaping how we understand Gettysburg fits into that larger theme of the war. And the idea that, geez, this is the turning point because it does fall chronologically pretty close to midway between the wars. So, from a narrative point of view, it makes really good sense to call it this. Um, so, he had this huge influence on the way people understand Gettysburg's place in the larger war. Um, what sense do you make out of that? And, was he right? Was he wrong? How do we grapple with that today as a legacy?
Yeah, John Bachelder, I have a love-hate relationship with him. I am glad that he saw the value of the historical nature of the battle and of the battlefield, and he was such a proponent of battlefield preservation as well as the preservation of these gentlemen's stories. And it's mostly the male military side that he focused on. He would focus somewhat on the civilians, but it's really on the mud and blood, as we say. but Bachelder was human, and Bachelder was also using this to make his living. He's not a great artist. He's not selling a ton of paintings. So I mean, he convinced Congress to give him $50,000 to write the history of Gettysburg. But what that gave us was a massive number of letters to and from Batchelder. In fact, I have 3 volumes of letters from veterans to and from him on my shelf right here. So it gives us voluminous numbers of letters. He also keeps meticulous maps about what's going on out on the battlefield. But over time, not being a trained historian, he allowed his personal views to shape the battle and the telling of it. I think you got right to it with a high watermark here. Batchelder is the one who comes up with this whole idea of the high watermark of the Confederacy, the big open, what looks like Bible sitting there by the copse of trees at the angle of the high watermark. That was his brainchild. Um, and that was a monument that if you were a state, you could put your name on it, but you had to give so much money to it to get your name into it, and he wanted to have that right there at the high water mark. He argued with veterans. I think one of my favorite stories comes from Winfield Scott Hancock. To paraphrase Hancock, he and Batchelder are on the field, and Hancock said, "Well, I was wounded over here on July 3rd." And Batchelder was like, "No, no, no, you were wounded over there." Hancock said, "No, I was wounded over there." Batchelder argues with him again, and Hancock just retorts, "I was here in 1863." Batchelder was not. So what you're seeing is somebody who didn't step foot on the battlefield as a soldier, nor was he a combatant, nor was he even a witness to it, but he came out there and would inform veterans, where they were. Now, granted, Batchelder spent more time on that battlefield than those veterans. He probably had a better idea of where these units would be because, again, you have a bunch of guys, let's say from South Carolina, who are marching onto a field in Pennsylvania for the first time, fight in a position for 20 minutes while they're being shot at, while they're under the stressors of battle, under smoke screens, and then leave. But so now, 50 years later, after they've come back for the first time in 50 years, are now supposed to go out to a point and say, "Hey, that's exactly where I fought here in this nondescript field." And so I think that Batchelder gives us both sides of the coin. This is a guy who had an obvious passion for it, but he had an invested financial interest for his not only his fame but his fortune to tie to the battle. But he does collect these maps and creates them. He also helps to create the Battlefield Commission. He also helps to place the first monuments there, and he collects these primary resources, as we call them, these letters from the men. So I think, like anything, you have to take the good with the bad. But Batchelder, I believe, did more good than bad. Some people would argue with me in the opposite.
And it is one of those things that I feel like I wrestle with constantly as a historian, telling other parts of the war and that, Gettysburg gets so much prominence as the turning point and as the high tide. And, I just, in July, I was on the battlefield and the licensed battlefield guide happened to say like, if this was the turning of the point of the war, and I think it was, and this was the culminating moment of this particular attack, which I think it was, then we could argue that this spot right here, and it's just like to me, I'm thinking Vicksburg is surrendering, in 24 hours. Like that's pretty important, and it didn't get any sort of mention or discussion at all. And so for me, that's kind of the way I always feel like I'm always kind of having to push back against the Gettysburg story. As wonderful as I think it is, and as marvelous as the battlefield is, and a special place, it's like I always feel like I'm still kind of fighting against the story of Gettysburg.
Well, and it's interesting you say that, fighting against the story of Gettysburg and the licensed battlefield guides. The reason that the guide service was founded um, in the 19 teens was because of the cottage industry that were guides. And you get off a train, you drive up in your car, you come in your wagon, and you basically be hit up to go onto the battlefield by guides, and they were of varying qualities. Some of these guys were veterans of the battle who were there telling their stories. Some were veterans of the war but hadn't fought there. Others were just people who were enthusiastic and trying to make a buck off the battle. And it became so problematic that these guys that they had to come up with a way to kind of weed out, the good from the bad when it came to the guides. So the licensed battlefield guide service came into existence because of this to fight it. Now, the licensed battlefield guide service has created its own issues, if you ask me, and I have passed the test, so this isn't me saying sour grapes, but you know, what story did these veterans want them to tell? Is something that you need to ask yourself. Why are these guides being licensed back in the early days? Is it because they're not telling the quote unquote right story? Is it not union enough? Is it not Southern enough? Is it not glorifying certain units over others? Is it that much misinformation that's going on out onto the battlefield? And believe me, I've heard some whoppers in my time out on the battlefield from amateurs and professionals. And I'm not saying licensed battlefield guides, but I'm saying professional guides on battlefields across the globe. Like, really? We all make mistakes, but I'm like, Jesus. So that's something that you have to ask yourself with it. What's the purpose behind them? Now, the guide service has carried on its tradition. It's now more than 100 years old. The licensing I think has gone over the top with this 4-level process to tell you about less than 1% of the war. But you know that I think also makes it somewhat inaccessible to the average person. I think it's while they put these people up on pedestals, these licensed guides, they know a lot about the battlefields and the battles, great. But in a way, it's like you need to know all that to work here. I don't want anything to do with that. I've heard that before. They're crazy. Other guide services like Antietam have popped up, Vicksburg, and um, I think it's good to have a licensing aspect. We have to take tests to do, certain tours in New Orleans, Charleston, Boston, all that. I think there you need to have a level of it. Gettysburg's maybe taking it a little over the top
Mhm.
uh, with that, but it's not because of the modern people who did that. This was because of the veterans who came back to the battlefield who didn't like the way their story was being told, so they pushed for a licensing system that is now carried on to this day. So I've often questioned, and I'd love to hear some of the stories that these veterans were hearing at that time, and then what led to the actual licensing. Were they really that? Were these people telling bald-faced lies, or were they just not playing up the roles of certain individuals or certain units?
Yeah, and we could even throw into that just the fallibility of memory, and people are just misremembering things wrong, and again, lots of factors into to creating some of that sort of dis or misinformation. And I
We see that
always,
all the time with the
yeah,
veterans, not fighting with each other. I mean, we're talking 25, 30, 40 years removed. These are guys who had never been back to these battlefields. They'd never been there in the first place. Then they show up, they spend an hour, 2 hours, maybe 2 days in a place, and then come back again 40, 50 years later. And look at how the world changes in just a decade. And now you're coming back 5 decades later where your memory's not as good into a place where you probably are being asked some leading questions. That's always another thing that I'm curious about. What are the questions these guys were asked when they're out on the field? You guys were over there, right? Yeah, we were over there. But in reality, they might have been on the other side of the battlefield, or they might not have been there in the first place. And I don't want to throw shade at these guys. I really don't. It's just you have to, as a historian, sit back and question the value of a source and what the source is saying, and when they're saying it, where they're saying it, and what audience are they saying it in front of. And I don't think that enough people take that into consideration. They just take the idea that it's gospel that these guys were here and fought there. Like, shit, go find the 84th Pennsylvania Monument at Gettysburg, find their flank markers, and then you tell me where they fought at Gettysburg, because they didn't. They got their $1,500 from the state of Pennsylvania. They were garden wagons, but they put their monument right beside the Pennsylvania Monument, flank markers and all. So not only are the veterans sometimes lying to themselves, the monuments might be lying to you as well.
that's right. And I think too, like, the level of minutia that people get into, beyond just the guide service, as far as like, you got to know this and that and the other thing. But like, we all now have mechanisms that I can look that up right now, as long as I've got cell service out on the battlefield. Like, so what's the value of knowing that minutia off the top of your head, so long as you're willing to just go look that up? And so to me, that sort of then casts that idea into that larger question, like, what's the purpose of knowing this, and knowing this level of detail, and why, and what are you doing with that information, versus a larger understanding of the war and being able to put this into context, and how do these events relate to what's going on elsewhere, which it seems to me a lot of folks aren't necessarily able to do because they're so focused on the colonel's shoe size and how many steps he took before he got a bullet on this particular part of his leg, and just, and so to me, I wrestle with that kind of, what do you do with that kind of knowledge?
Well, I have no I have no foot to stand on in this, because I used to be a minutia man, and
I describe you to my friends as the person who knows the shoe size of the lieutenant colonel's wife because, like, you are really good with those sorts of facts.
oh, I know a lot of useless information, and I always bring it out for tours, and that's about the only time I could use it. And I'm not going to lie to you. The one of the main reasons that I know that much minutia is because of Gettysburg. I love the battlefield. Those are the books that were produced on it. Those are the guides that I engage with. And I make no apologies for knowing these things. But as I got older, I'm like, man, what does that actually add? To a tour, it adds some flavor and color. But like you said, it didn't add the context to the war. And I was just actually having this conversation with my mother the other night about the Gettysburg Address. She's arguing with me. Everyone needs to know the Gettysburg Address. I should be able to recite it. I said, why? And because we had to learn it. I said, rote memorization doesn't do anything for it. You need to know the reason behind Lincoln's words. What did they mean? I said, it's great to recite it. That's fine. But you need to know what he meant by that. But when it came to the minutia, one of the reasons I learned so much of it is because of the guide test. I mean, the stuff that they asked me on it, like, you were into the weeds. Um, and I don't fault the folks for knowing that. Now, it's funny that you said about the phone being there. The people right there have a computer in their pocket. What I first went off to college, in the early days of computers being accessible, my mentor, my first mentor at college, he always said, "Your a historian's only as good as his resources." So he always allowed us to take tests with our books or whatever. We weren't allowed to ask each other questions, but he said, I've never been in a situation, a historian, where I've not been allowed to go and reference a reference book or something. So I was like, oh, that's interesting. Gary on Sunday made the absolute great comment that as guides, it is now tougher and tougher with the people with the phones in their pockets because they can check you on the spot. In the years past,
Yeah.
those whoppers might have been gone over on some folks. But now, if you say a whopper, or even if you misspeak, because I mean, my God, we do most of this off the cuff. Few of us use notes and stuff like that, at least in our circle. And it's easy to misspeak, and someone's right there. I mean, the favorite thing of any Civil War buff is to prove someone else wrong. I think we
Yeah.
all know that. Their greatest joy, they sit back and wait for that one little nugget of information that they've learned. And then once you come across it, they're going to inflict that pain upon you. And then whenever you try to get the context from them, of course, they've given you their nugget, and that's all they can give to you. So as I ramble here, it's I think there's people out there who want this information, who love this type of stuff. I'm not going to lie, I love the minutia of it, but you have to be able to then put it into context. You know, I'll say it. What I'm about to tell you has absolutely nothing to do with the Battle of Gettysburg. It's not going to help your understanding, but it's a fun story. It's an interesting story. But I also want to make sure that I circle back to the larger picture and tie it in to Port Hudson, Vicksburg, Tullahoma that's happening. My favorite thing that happened, as I go off topic here, as I'm known to do, was when one of our friends told us, the Battle of Chancellorsville led directly to the Battle of Gettysburg. And the two of us were like, really? Tell us more about
Do
this.
tell. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was
Now,
and
and,
that was
and
a
you even brought, go
that
ahead.
was a light bulb moment for him too. And we're like, oh yeah.
It was. And he's a seasoned historian. But, you brought it up yesterday to me. And I think what made me a much, much, much better historian, I mean, taking the God test absolutely did. Um, but becoming a intern and then a seasonal and then a ranger down at Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park, I had to learn 18 months of the war, and I had a pretty good background because of Gettysburg, honest to God. Um, I had to learn 18 months of the war, 4 different orders of battle. I had to learn a city landscape. I had to learn a rural landscape. I had to learn a civilian landscape, slavery, that aspect of it, the political government. I mean, I came out of Fred Spot is a much more well-rounded historian, and most people who I've engaged with, who've engaged with folks who were trained by Greg Mertz, Bob Crick, and others down at Fred Spot, have said the best historians have come out of Fred Spot. Yes, I am patting ourselves on the back, but at the same time, I think it's true because it's like, okay, Gettysburg, forget what you know, let's start over here.
Yeah, yeah. And yeah, probably the most useful thing that I learned as part of all that training was when Greg Merch said, if you don't know something, go look it up because you're only as good as your resources. Just tell someone like, hey, I don't know. Let's go back to the visitor center. I got a library there. We'll pull some stuff out. We'll track this stuff down. It's okay to not know it on the spot so long as you're willing to go and dig something up. So, what responsibility do we have as historians to help people certainly still understand Gettysburg if they love Gettysburg, but to contextualize that as well? Because, you and I know folks who, Gettysburg's the end all be all, and so they really they chase Gettysburg, they promote Gettysburg, and then that I think inflates the importance of Gettysburg. So then people want more Gettysburg, and it becomes this self-perpetuating cycle that might sometimes be hard to break out of for buffs, for students, for historians, for tourists, casual visitors. What responsibility do we have as historians to kind of work with that elephant?
Dude, Gettysburg is an addiction, man. It's
Uh,
like we need to get the methadone for Gettysburg. When you look at a Civil War roundtable, it's almost guaranteed if they put a Gettysburg topic, more butts are going to be in the seats. If we put a Gettysburg video up on the American Battlefield Trust website or YouTube channel, we're going to put more views in there. If you put on a tour, more people are going to be apt to go to Gettysburg. Now, granted, there are people who are like, oh, not another Gettysburg video or whatever. I think it's you have to walk the fine line because we have colleagues who are on both sides of the aisle. We have Gary, who I work for. I mean, it's an absolute obsession for him. It's an addiction. He loves it. He'll be the first person to tell you. But we have our other friends who either in the Western Theater, the Trans Mississippi Theater, or another battlefield, are like, oh, Gettysburg, not again. So you get this like this complete bucking against the tradition. So I try to come down in the middle. My God, these people are interested in our subject. Embrace it. We used to have a colleague at the Park Service, if you remember, when someone walked through the door and complained about Gods and Jackson. Yes, I know it's Gods and Generals, but let's be real, it's Gods and Jackson, the movie. He would just eviscerate the person for watching this movie, and like that's what brought them here to the
ah,
battlefields. So I think that you have to first off embrace that they love this battle, and you have to be careful not to break that person's enthusiasm. I really do. I think that you have to be careful with it. You want to keep it moving forward, but at the same time, you want to put it into context. Um, because there are, I mean, I think Gettysburg is 0.02% of the entire Civil War, the 3 day battle, I think is how it breaks down to. So you want to, gently remind them like, yeah, Gettysburg is important here in the Eastern Theater because it's close to Washington, it's close to Baltimore, New York, Philadelphia. Lee has pushed north of the Mason-Dixon line, but right now in Middle Tennessee, we're about to launch the Tullahoma campaign, which will cut deep into the heart of the Confederacy. Grant's about to take Vicksburg. Port Hudson's about to fall a few days later. So you have these dominoes that are all in place about to fall. Then, of course, it's the lead into Gettysburg. Chancellorsville, to me, is a far more interesting battle than Gettysburg. I think there's as much, if not more, on the line for the Confederates there at Chancellorsville, being outnumbered 2-1. Yes, you have the wounding of Stonewall Jackson, uh, but you also have a bloodletting there at Chancellorsville that's only second to Antietam in one day. May 3rd of 1863, there's 22,000 plus casualties. September 17th, 1862, it's 23,000 casualties. So you have that, talk about the casualties. Then it's also taking it beyond the 3 days at Gettysburg and bringing it back in November of 1863 to what Lincoln says in 272 words in just under 3 minutes. He time travels utilizing his words in the Gettysburg Address, taking us back to the founding of the nation, the Declaration of Independence, bringing us to the present where we're in a civil war, taking us to the future of what this nation should look like afterwards or could look like. So he is giving meaning in 3 minutes or less to 3 days of battle and 51,000 plus casualties. So I think trying to politely and kindly say, yes, the battle's important. Yes, it's important to know that the 20th Maine lost 137 men and the 137th New York on the other flank lost 137 men. Useless ass information whenever it comes down to it, but that's stuff people like to know. Um, but being able to put that in a larger context. Now, as a historian, again, to close off, I think it's important not to crush someone's spirit. And I've seen it, dude. I have seen it. I've seen it. I've seen it with historians who are academic, public historians, who just lay into a person for being interested in something, and it's very accusatory. It's like, you know what? It's a symbiotic relationship. That person came to this battlefield and now are engaged in it. And guess what? Those are the same people who might be in your classroom giving you your job in academia or coming to your museum and paying you the $19 to see your display that's overpriced, by the way, so that you can have a job and to spread the love with this. So I think that's the double-edged sword. Now, is it right that people focus completely on Gettysburg? I can't say that's right or wrong, but that's just the reality of it. It's the most written on topic of the American Civil War outside of Abraham Lincoln. It's not the most written on thing in history, like some people would say. That's Napoleon's life. There have been more books written about Napoleon since days he's been dead. So Napoleon is more popular whenever it comes to the world stage, but Gettysburg is up there. We have British, we have French, we have people from all over the world who come here to learn about the battle, but a lot of them like to focus on the Gettysburg Address.
Yeah. There is a Gettysburg Industrial Complex, and it is focused on getting people to uh, pay attention to the battle, to enjoy the battle. It ranges everywhere from education to entertainment, and I think just being conscious of the fact that that complex exists and people kind of get sucked into it a little bit, whether they realize it or not. I think that awareness might be helpful for folks too, so that they kind of just understand that they're not just caught up in the momentum of the hobby, but that there's also some other ways that they can maybe explore the battle and the battlefield and the story, and kind of break beyond that industrial complex and the gravitational pull that it has.
Well,
Having
I,
said
I
that,
think a
oh,
lot
go
of it
ahead.
also comes back to how much time you have in Gettysburg. I think
Yeah.
people underestimate the size of the battle and the battlefield. And also, like, I run our field trip program for the Trust, the American Battlefield Trust, and we send kids and classes to historic sites. We have an emphasis on battlefields, obviously, but we send them to places that are at least tied to the three wars that we we represent at the Trust. And it's always the top three places they want to go to on these field trips when they apply for our grant funding will be Gettysburg, Washington, D.C., and Boston. So most of these people who have engaged with Gettysburg, it's probably they've done it as a kid. West
Yeah.
Point, the senior class trip is what's going to take you there. Is your last year at West Point. We have Bradley, MacArthur, Eisenhower, many others who come there for that last year at West Point. Um, so, I think that when they come here, especially the teachers with their field trips, they see the visitor center, they see the cyclorama, they do a 2.5 hour guided tour with an LBG, and then they move on. And there's more to it. I think that's something that people forget. In the old days, I mean, my God, people never came into downtown Gettysburg before the downtown guide service and other things in downtown. I mean, it was like the locals were in downtown, and then along Steinway and out York Road, that's where the tourists were. And now it's finally kind of all
Yeah.
coming together with the new Adams County Historical Society, and Seminary Ridge Museum, and others.
Yeah, yeah. And we've taken a somewhat cautionary approach with our conversation today. And I kind of want to end just by reminding folks, like Kris and I both love Gettysburg. It was a place that's super significant to both of us. That's the first battlefield I visited on one of those field trips as a kid in from Hershey, Pennsylvania. Adams County Historical Society is doing wonderful things with their interpretation, their new museum, the Shriver House. They're getting ready to do a Black History Museum. The Seminary Ridge Museum is wonderful. So lots of really, I think, first class opportunities to go and learn about the battle in new, exciting, cool ways. So it still remains a wonderful, vibrant, important part to the overall Civil War community for sure.
Yeah, I would say, the people who are complaining the electric map's not there anymore will go down the road to Hanover and see the electric map if you're an old purist. The wax museum's not there anymore. You do have to change with the times. And we see that with the battlefield. I mean, the current generation of folks living in Gettysburg are no different than the people who were there in 1863. They have to make a living, and then after that, they're starting to learn how to make a living with a place where history inflicted itself upon. These
Yeah.
people didn't ask for this to happen there. Now you have the largest battle here in the North American continent, even though Fredericksburg's bigger. You have the largest battle in terms of combatants firing at one another. And, you would be crazy not to do something to take advantage of it. I mean, my God, go over to Normandy, go to some of the beaches, and my favorite stories are they have these pictures on the restaurants. Merci to our defenders. Thank you to I'm sorry, our liberators. Thank you to our liberators. And it's just a way to get the veterans to come into their store. It's just a way to get the people to come in there. And believe me, the people in Normandy really do appreciate the Allied efforts over there. But I've often said they're also trying to get you into the store. So the same thing's happening in Gettysburg. But what's different is the generation now, we have new technologies, we have new interpretations, we have new resources to work with. So if you head over to the Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center, you can climb into the cupola. You couldn't do that 30 years ago. You can see where John Buford stood. You can stand in his boot steps. You can go over to the Adams County Historical Society, known now as Gettysburg History, and go to the Beyond the Battle exhibit and go to their exhibits that they have where you can literally step into a building with bullets flying around and all this cool stuff. You can go see the cyclorama, which was the 3D movie of its day whenever it was installed in Gettysburg. So, there's the old stuff, there's the new stuff, but Gettysburg, like many of these places, they have a resource there, and you can't blame folks for taking advantage of it. Now, as a historian, it's our job to make sure we nurture the resource, nurture the people's interest. But we do have to be careful of saying, like, yes, Gettysburg's 3 days are absolutely important to this war. And I have an ancestor who fell there, who's mortally wounded there. I have an ancestor who's trained there during World War One. So it's a special place to me. But there's a lot of other stuff happening in the American Civil War. It is such in time a small piece of the puzzle, but in the larger scope of things and in the story, it looms larger than life.
Yeah. That's a great point to end on. So I'm going to leave it there. Kris, thanks so much for taking some time to join us today to chat about this.
Thank you for having me. And we hope that folks will go over to Gettysburg. If you've never been there before, it's absolutely worth your time and effort. And don't judge poor other battlefields like Spotsylvania, Chancellorsville, and others when you arrive there and there aren't quite as many monuments. Because I've heard that, like, where are all the monuments? It's like, well, so be kind to the other
Be
battlefields.
kind to the other battlefield. On behalf of Kris White, I'm Kris Mikowski for Emerging Civil War. Thanks for being with us today on the Emerging Civil War podcast. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.